Hey everybody, welcome to Thursdays in the Parables. We are talking tonight about the parable of the unjust judge, which is found in Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. I do not have a PowerPoint tonight, so it'll still be the same format. I just won't have the PowerPoint listing all the points of information. So if you're taking notes, I'll try to break that down as best as I can, like normal. So the parable that we're talking about tonight, again, it deals with prayer. It's very similar in some instances, at least the application maybe, and the overall point in some ways is similar to the parable that we talked about last week with the friend at midnight in Luke chapter 11. But in Luke 18, we've got another parable about prayer, and we're going to note a few things about it, as we always do with the background, the text, and the application. So, we'll look at Luke chapter 18, verse 1, sort of given the background in verse 1. He spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. So again, we've got an occasion where Jesus is talking to his followers about how they, talking about the nature of prayer and how they should pray. And as specifically noted in verse 1, that they always ought to pray. Now, in Luke 18, we are given a parable of something that many, again, would have been familiar with, at least this type of relationship, concerning a judge and a widow. And so, noting that, it's important to keep in mind that the Old Testament did put a premium on protecting especially those that were the most vulnerable in society. Widows and orphans were among the people that were the most vulnerable in society. And there were laws given in the law of Moses that were designed to protect them. That the justices, the judges, had a responsibility to look out for the welfare of these people. And so in Luke chapter 18, what's presented is a normal scenario. You've got a widow who needs to essentially be taken care of by a judge. And it was expected for judges to obviously rule in a fair manner and to pass down judgment to help protect widows and orphans. When you think about the nature of widows, they were the most vulnerable in society in some ways that we don't necessarily, that we may not know necessarily of personal experience. In the sense that when you think about a widow back then, generally, they could not own property. Once their husband had died, generally that would pass on to another brother. And if you think about the position of a widow, she essentially had to rely on other people to take care of her because it was seen that the husband took care, provided for the wife, right, financially and things of that nature. And so sometimes what happened when a widow died was either that she would remain a part of her husband's family, but sometimes she would essentially be treated as a lesser person, almost, in some cases, almost the position of a servant within the family, or she had the option of going back to her own family, at which point the dowry or the payment that was made by the husband's family when they got married, that money had to be returned. And so in either way, it was sort of tough to be a widow at this point. And so if you think about an example of this in the New Testament, you think about Anna, who's mentioned in Luke chapter 2. She became a widow, and it stated that she worked in the temple after she became a widow, worked for all of her life because, she dedicated herself to the service of God, but she also had to rely on the help of others in order to survive. So a widow was a very vulnerable person in society. Luke chapter 18, we've got a judge that is being approached by a widow saying that she needs to be avenged of her adversary. We don't know exactly what it is. Sometimes people could take advantage of widows just based on property laws and things like that. Whatever the case may be, the widow's in a position where she really cannot fend for herself, and so she's having to rely on a judge to help settle a dispute. But the thing about this judge that's mentioned in verse 2, the judge does not fear God, neither regarded man. And so what's given to us is that this is a judge that has no concern for what at this point, the law of Moses said about taking care of widows. The fact that he doesn't have any regard for man, just the idea that he doesn't have an outlook of compassion for humanity. We might could say he's selfish in a way. But in verses 4 and 5, you see that she comes and she's going to this judge over and over again to try to get him to rule in her favor. Right, verse 4, he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, though I fear not God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. And so at the end of the day, the judge does help the woman with her problems, but not because of the goodness of the judge's heart, just because he finds the woman to be annoying and he wants the matter taken care of. You remember last week we talked about how the friend at midnight, the owner of the house, he didn't represent God's idea or perspective or actions toward those that pray to him. And so you've got a similar idea being carried forward here in Luke 18. God is not like this unjust judge who rules and helps this defenseless woman out because of the goodness of his heart. This man's doing it just because he doesn't want her to be an annoyance anymore. That's in contrast to God, who helps the defenseless out and helps Christians out, because in a sense we are defenseless. We have to rely on God, and God doesn't do that because he's annoyed with us. He does that because of the great compassion that he has. And that's what Jesus emphasizes verses 6 through 8. Verse 7, Jesus says, and shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? Now, when you're thinking about this, again, being at least a directive for why the disciples should continue to pray and not to faint, because of what God will do in the end. And if we put ourselves in the shoes of the apostles, this makes a whole lot more sense what Jesus is talking about. Because, they're going to face persecution. Not just now during the ministry of Jesus, but once Jesus leaves. We know through the book of Acts that a lot of Christians face persecution. And it happened repeatedly, over and over again. Think about Peter and John. Several times in the first few chapters in the book of Acts, you see Peter being in prison. Paul references being in prison throughout his letters and the persecution that he faced. And so the mindset that could develop among some of these apostles was that, we keep suffering over and over again, and this must mean that God really does not care for us. And for some to take that mindset, this could lead some to abandoning the faith, that we keep suffering persecution over and over again. We suffer hardship over and over again, and we're not vindicated, we're not saved by God in the process, because it seems like this affliction keeps on going over and over again. Almost sort of like Job. When you think about Job and how he was afflicted, and he wanted God to help him, but it appeared, at least in Job's mind, that God was just ignoring him. Job might have thought of God just like what this unjust judge was. These apostles that are going to suffer persecution could very well think about God in this same light, as an unjust judge who is not helping, seeing to the needs of his afflicted servants. Rather, Jesus is saying that, really a practical point, even though you are going to suffer persecution later on, right now, don't think that God's not concerned with you because he's allowing you to suffer all of these things. God indeed does care for you. And so the apostles might have taken the mindset that God did not care because of how often persecution came. But in reality, Jesus is reminding them that, even though you may be afflicted and it feels like God's not listening to you, at the end of the day, God will avenge his people, or will vindicate his people. Maybe that doesn't happen in this life on earth. Maybe that happens in eternity. So that's sort of the text. Let's talk for a moment about 2 points of application. Again, we always need to keep in mind just the fact that God's not indifferent to our affliction. You know, it may be that we're praying about something, whether that's sickness, whether that's some type of illness we're dealing with. Maybe we're dealing with problems in the family, you know, family members that are struggling with sickness. Maybe we're dealing with problems at work and we're praying over and over again about those problems, and sometimes it may appear that things are not getting better. Maybe sometimes it appears that things are getting worse. And so the mindset is, you know, we keep praying to God over and over again, but things aren't changing. This must mean that God doesn't care what's happening to us right now. It's easy to fall in that mindset, but what Jesus is pointing out here is that, you know, maybe your affliction, the problems that you're praying about, they may not go away quickly as you want to. They may never go away, you know, in this physical life, but don't think that that means that God does not care, because at the end of the day, if you're faithful to Him, He's going to make sure that you are okay, right? Because of the promise of salvation. And that sort of brings up another point that, you know, when we're thinking about this, you know, we are vulnerable. There's nothing wrong with us as Christians to think about it in that light, that a lot of times we are this widow, right? We are vulnerable. We have to rely on God for help. And if we keep that mindset, you know, we'll keep coming back to God and praying to Him, and we won't faint, as what Jesus told His apostles not to do. He didn't want them to faint. We won't faint because we know that God's not indifferent to our affliction. And a point that is similar to it, which is sort of our second major point of application, is that a lack of intervention does not mean that we are justified in turning our backs on God. In the religious history class that I'm teaching, this week we've been talking about persecution within the early church. And it could have been the case that a lot of Christians turned their back on God because they suffered through various waves of persecution, and even though they were praying for that relief, it never came. And so some of them may very well have turned their back on God because they felt justified. You know, God, if you're not going to listen to my prayers and answer them, then that means, why do I need to obey you? Job, again, sort of had that same mindset. You know, Job wanted to question God about the things that he did because Job felt that his prayers as pleased to God were not being answered. And then Job, of course, is corrected at the end of the book. And it goes to show the point, again, that, you know, even though God may not directly intervene in the time frame that we want to, that's not justification for us to turn our backs on God. Because if we keep being patient, if we're faithful to the end, we know what awaits for us. And so that's important to keep in mind. I think those are the main points of application that we can draw from Luke 18. Again, it's similar to Luke 11, but both deal with prayer. Now, next week we'll talk about the parable that immediately comes after this, Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, with the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. And that parable, again, is going to deal with prayer and really about how we should approach God in prayer. But we will save that for next week. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope to be able to see you all on Sunday.